The Great War is considered by many historians to be the first modern military conflict. Weapons used by most armies throughout the 20th century, such as tanks, planes, and machine guns, had their baptism of fire there. On that bloody battlefield, a young corporal stood out on the German side for his bravery and patriotism. It was none other than Adolf Hitler, who had joined the fighting immersed in a nationalist and patriotic fervor. That is why today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you everything about Adolf Hitler's war career during the First World War. We will discover the hard and bloody battles that ended up cementing his dangerous ideology, which would leave its dark mark in the years to come.
The First World War made Hitler possible. The First World War gave him a purpose, an aim, a commitment, and subsequently a mission.
In 1913, the tensions that would lead to the outbreak of World War I the following year could already be felt throughout Europe. The system of alliances that countries had built, instead of preventing disputes, made them more prone to them. With the slightest spark, the entire continent would be dragged into a bloody and brutal conflict. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was one of the powers most willing to start battles, looking with hungry eyes at the Balkan territories it had been seeking to annex for years. It knew that Germany would be on its side, but it would have to face the triple alliance formed by the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. One was attentively waiting to see what would happen, while patriotic feelings increased by giant steps, and national armies were filled with enthusiastic young people. One Austrian citizen, who saw in the possible war an opportunity to improve his situation, was Adolf Hitler. In 1913, he was 24 years old, but he had already become disillusioned with life. Although he dreamed of becoming a painter, the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna had rejected him twice, leaving him with an uncertain future. He was forced to sleep in street shelters, surviving by selling his paintings. But in May 1913, he received the inheritance from his father Alois, who had died 10 years earlier. He used this money to move from the Austrian capital to Munich. Hitler felt repulsed by the empire where he was born, since he considered his racial mix to be something impure. The streets were filled with Hungarians, Slavs, Jews, Romanians, and people from many other peoples. Despite sharing this mix, the young painter already dreamed of an Aryan ethnostate, superior to the rest, according to his twisted ideology. On July 28, 1914, what the world suspected finally happened. A month after Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated, this nation declared war on Serbia, whom it blamed for the attack. The alliance system was activated, and in the blink of an eye, the entire continent was taking up arms. Hitler, despite his dislike of his native country for its aforementioned multi-ethnic character, was drafted into the Austrian army. But due to his poor physical condition, caused by years of wandering, he was deemed unfit for service. For him, this was a relief, as he thought that the days of the empire were numbered. However, the young man was eager to be part of the conflict, but he wanted to join the German forces allied to Austria, which he considered clearly superior. Despite having lived on its territory for just over a year, he already fully identified himself as a German. The problem was that he did not have citizenship. Nevertheless, he volunteered for the Army of Bavaria, a state in southeastern Germany. Incredibly, his application was accepted.
Hitler was amongst those who was extremely elated at going into this war. He joined up 2 or 3 days later and was let in as an Austrian. He should have been sent back to Austria, but he was actually permitted to join the German army by a bureaucratic mistake, and subsequently that was his lever for not being deported back to Austria after the end of the First World War. Had that been the case, then history may well have been very different.
Adolf Hitler joined the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment. According to his comrades in the unit, the Austrian seemed very excited about the start of the fighting. He tended to have an almost religious attitude towards his rifle, which some compared to that of a woman with her jewelry. He could spend hours cleaning it, and his colleagues mentioned that he looked at it with adoration. His squadron was stationed in Munich for a few months until they completed their basic training. After swearing loyalty to Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany and King Ludwig III of Bavaria, they were transported by train to the Western Front, where they would experience the horrors of war firsthand. The regiment was based in Lille, France, a city that was in German hands. The place, which only a few months ago was considered one of the most beautiful in the country, was completely in ruins. Most of the buildings were destroyed. Almost no one walked the streets, and artillery could be heard constantly nearby. The fighting now focused on the Ypres region of Belgium, where the British and French were resisting the German advance. It was here that Hitler's unit had its baptism of fire. The First Battle of Ypres, which began on October 19, 1914, was merciless. It was the beginning of the grueling trench fighting that would characterize the Great War in the following years. Thousands of soldiers died under rifle, machine gun, and artillery fire, but the armies only managed to conquer a few meters of territory. The muddy ground made progress extremely difficult and caused the tunnels dug to be in constant danger of collapsing. The terrible conditions in which both forces found themselves spread disease among the combatants very easily. These killed almost as many soldiers as bullets. In the first days of combat alone, Hitler's regiment came under fierce attack from enemy guns, which caused numerous casualties in his unit. They had been given the task of taking the village of Geluveld, which was heavily defended by the British. For 20 days they tried to conquer it, but they could not overcome their rivals. The battles often came down to hand-to-hand combat, where there was no room to fire rifles and bayonets. Knives, fists, and even teeth had to be used. After 3 unsuccessful offensives, the 4th ended in a German victory, but at a high cost. Of the 3,600 soldiers in the regiment when they arrived at Ypres, only 600 were in fighting condition. Hitler's company of 250 men had been reduced to 42. The rest were wounded or dead in the Belgian fields. The young man who would become the German Führer fought on the front lines together with the rest of his regiment. Despite the huge number of casualties in these first days of war, Hitler emerged unscathed. In his diary, he mentioned how enemy attacks killed, wounded, and destroyed everything around him, but he also spoke of the pride he felt for his unit. His performance during the campaign impressed his colleagues and superiors, and the latter decided to try him in a new role. He was assigned as a runner, a position full of dangers since it was much more exposed than that of the rest of the soldiers. He had to carry messages from headquarters to the battlefront and vice versa, without being able to take refuge in the trenches. Troop movements depended on the men in this role and therefore the fate of the battle. But despite the risks, Hitler took on his new job with dedication and resilience. No matter how harsh the fighting, the Austrian did not complain and fulfilled his objectives with enthusiasm. Although at that time this was a desirable quality, years later it would become the terror of those who would represent the target of his dark purposes. They experienced firsthand how Adolf Hitler never let those he considered his enemies slip through his fingers. Of the regiment's 8 runners, half had died by the end of 1914. Among the 4 survivors was the future German leader. For his bravery, Hitler was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class on the 2nd of December, recommended by his unit leader, Colonel Engelhardt. He was also promoted in rank to Gefreiter, equivalent to a private first class.
In 1932, Colonel Engelhardt gave more details of the award of the Iron Cross Second Class to Hitler he made in 1914. Quote, "Once, as I emerged from the wood at Weizsäter during a fierce attack in order to make some observations, Hitler and an orderly from the regimental staff planted themselves bang in front of me to shield me with their own bodies from machine gun fire."
By early 1915, trench warfare had become the norm. Fighters spent weeks crammed into damp, muddy trenches, where disease and rats roamed freely. But they weren't the only ones lurking in the area. If you stuck your head out just a few inches, you risked being shot by a sniper. The trenches served as shelter that allowed them to lessen the risk of death in an artillery attack. But they were never completely safe. Hitler's 16th Regiment was assigned to the defense of the French village of Neuve-Chapelle against the British offensive that wanted to liberate it. During the fighting, the battlefront became confused, with entire units passing behind enemy lines and suddenly finding themselves surrounded. Several runners fell to the bullets trying to carry out the directives that sought to restore order. But despite the danger, Adolf Hitler was once again able to accomplish his mission without being injured. Following the German defeat in this battle on the 13th of March 1915, and due to the intensity of the fighting, some of the regiment's members were given a short leave to go home. Among these men was the Austrian soldier, but he refused. According to his comrades, he had no interest in returning to civilian life, even for a few days. He never received letters or packages from relatives, friends, or partners, unlike many other serving combatants. Hitler did not seem to exist outside the army, and according to the testimonies of his comrades, he preferred it that way.
Even Alexander Moritz Frey, a medic who disliked Hitler and later became a science fiction writer and fled Germany after Hitler came to power, nonetheless wrote of Hitler, quote, "When people claim that he had been a coward, that's not true," unquote. Frey nonetheless thought Gefreiter Hitler to be a backstabber and a selfish individual who impressed only the youngest, most impressionable soldiers with his nationalistic rhetoric.
His nationalist ideology only grew in the years that followed, and he would speak at length about it to anyone who would pay even the slightest attention. Even though the Germans began to show signs of wear and tear in the second half of the Great War, Hitler still believed fervently in German superiority. Any defeat or setback suffered was the fault of external factors. The Jewish people were his favorite target, whom he pointed out as traitors to the interests of the empire. On July 1st, 1916, one of the bloodiest battles in the entire Great War began, when British forces launched an offensive near the Somme River. For 3.5 months, the British and Germans faced each other in brutal and cruel fights. where tens of thousands died for just a few meters of land. Chemical weapons, such as mustard gas and flamethrowers, were already commonplace by then. And the screams of those affected, who felt their skin burning until it disintegrated, could be heard day and night. Many others were blinded by the effects of the chemicals, or became unable to breathe normally. Deaths were slow and painful. Despite the supposed illegality of these instruments, which had been banned in 1899, the soldiers continued to fight. Hitler's regiment was transferred to the front, where they remained for 10 days near the village of Bapaume. On average, their daily losses were 120 men killed and wounded. Even the Austrians seemed to see his luck end when a British shell hit the place where the runners were sheltered. 4 of them died, and another 7 were seriously wounded. Hitler received a splinter from the explosive in the face, and although he had to be treated, he was allowed to return to combat quickly. But his return would be brief. On October 12th, still on the Somme, Hitler volunteered to carry a message to the front. But during his mission, an artillery shell hit near him and a splinter penetrated his left thigh. He had to be removed from the battle and taken to a military hospital, where he spent the next 2 months. During his recovery, the fighting on the Somme ended without a decisive winner, but both sides suffered a staggering number of casualties. The battlefront advanced only 12 kilometers, allowing the English a meager gain in territory. The cost of this victory was around 150,000 British and French dead, and almost the same number of Germans. The wounded exceeded 1 million. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, and the survivors sustained wounds, internal or external, that they would carry for the rest of their lives. This is how one of them tells us, veteran Tom Dewing.
How can you describe seeing a mere handful of men come where you were used to seeing a battalion? And we weren't the only ones who felt sick. The colonels were sitting in front of what was left of their men, sobbing. There were so few men left.
Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler was sent to Munich against his will to finish his recovery. But he could not bear to be away from the front, so he wrote a letter to the captain of the regiment asking for permission to return to active service. He was granted permission, returning in March 1917. Fighting continued throughout that year, but the armies did not leave French territory. By then, the German situation was becoming increasingly complicated. The naval blockade that the Franco-British alliance had imposed on the Germans at the beginning of the war, with the aim of preventing supplies from reaching the country, began to be felt more seriously. Food reserves began to rapidly diminish. Both civilians and soldiers were forced to ration their food, and even then there was often not enough. Hitler and his comrades often sneaked out at night to cut the meat from dead horses. Despite this, Germany continued to fight, but casualties were increasing. The last German offensive took place on March 21, 1918, when German forces launched a massive attack just 80 kilometers from Paris. The 16th Regiment took part in the so-called Battle of the Kaiser, where it suffered numerous dead and wounded, as did the rest of its divisions. However, Adolf Hitler distinguished himself again. On May 26th, while running with a message, he came across a group of 8 French soldiers who were retreating back to their positions. Despite being greatly outnumbered and armed with only a pistol, he was able to capture them on his own and bring them back to the German lines. For this action, he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, very rarely awarded to ordinary soldiers. These were the words of Officer Hugo Gutmann, who recommended that the Austrian receive this medal.
A Jewish officer who had been awarded the Iron Cross First Class himself in 1915 wrote in his citation of Hitler, quote, "As a runner, his coolness and dash in both trench and open warfare have been exemplary, and invariably he has shown himself ready to volunteer for tasks in the most difficult situations and at great danger to himself. Whenever communications have been totally disrupted at a critical moment in a battle, it has been thanks to Hitler's unflagging and devoted efforts that important messages have continued to get through despite every difficulty."
Ironically, Hugo Gutmann was of Jewish origin, and in the years to come he would witness firsthand the terrible ideas of the man he once celebrated. Despite Hitler's bravery, the fate of the war was already sealed. On October 15, 1918, the soldier was wounded again, this time by a British mustard gas attack. Temporarily blinded, he was evacuated to the German town of Pasewalk. He was there on November 11th when he learned that Germany had signed its surrender. World War I was over. Disillusioned, Hitler returned to Munich more convinced than ever of the guilt of Jews, Roma, and other peoples for the defeat of the country he had taken as his own. After the end of the conflict, the German Empire was embroiled in a short revolution that ended with the establishment of the Weimar Republic and a parliamentary government in place of the emperor. Because communism was on the rise, mainly thanks to the birth of the Soviet Union in 1917, anyone with opposing ideas was welcome. Hitler had made his anti-socialist position clear, so he was allowed to stay in the army even when his battalion was disbanded. His new role was to infiltrate a new, insignificant organization, to spy on its actions. This was the German Workers' Party. But in them, Hitler saw the opportunity to bring his extreme and discriminatory ideology to many more people. He quickly began to rise in power in the association, which in 1920 changed its name. The Nazi Party was born. In just a few years, one of the darkest periods in world history would begin, and the young Austrian soldier, who had distinguished himself during the war for his bravery, would become its greatest architect. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what do you think would have happened if Hitler was not accepted into the German army? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.